too much stuff on one side. Feel unbalanced. That's all right, though. Never fails. There we go. All right, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. For our visitor, I'm Britt. I'm Britt McDowell. I'm the what's my title now these days? I'm an elder, and I'm also the vice chair of the board. And so my Sunday, to give you a little background, we're in a transition period. So we have some fill-in ministers, and we have some members of the congregation that deliver our message on Sunday. And so we're kind of doing the many shoulders, many hands, handling the burden. And we've actually really liked how things have went so far. So it's exciting to be able. It's been a little work on Louise. I don't think Louise is excited about it as we are, but that's okay. I can, if she would ask, I can help more along those lines. So Rachel's video this morning, John 3:16. That's prolific. I mean, we hear that. That's a thought that this is not on my sermon topic, so we weren't that well aligned. But this is just a thought to go along with this. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in Him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And the most important thing is skipped and forgotten most of the time in verse 3:17. For God sent His Son not to condemn the world, but that through Him the world would be saved. And as Christians and as believers and as the ambassadors of Jesus, that's more important, I think, than the first part. Because sometimes we get hung up in morality, we get hung up in right and wrong, and those things that are out there, that big S word, sin, which I think last time I preached, I talked about sin. You shouldn't judge somebody because they sin differently than you. And it's not our job to worry about that. In the current political movement, we have a lot of legislation to legislate morality and tell people what's right and wrong and do that. And that's not what we're called to do. We're called to love. If we're to be like Jesus, Jesus loved the world and He didn't condemn the world. He came and He was an example and He was an influence. And we're going to talk about that influence today. So let's talk about the world here real quick. That's always fun to kind of, point down at things here. Depending on which reality you subscribe to, which that's an important thing to say because reality is perception plus experience and perspective, you could think that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. It's gloom and doom and apocalyptic and all this crazy stuff's coming on, but just some stats. The world right now is the peak of human civilization. We are at the pinnacle today. We have more people who are literate. Poverty is the lowest it's ever been. Medical advancements are coming at the fastest rate they ever have. There are fewer people in poverty around the world today than there has ever been. People are living longer. There is less hunger. And believe it or not, there is less conflict, there is less war, there is less military than there has ever been in the history of mankind. But you don't know that unless you know where to look. Because that's not what sells. That's not what we're told. Hey, media's out there slinging fear because the more afraid you are, the more engaged you watch, negative emotions, all things that go with it. I want to remind you, sometimes we often hear today as Christians that we're the most persecuted we've ever been, which is the biggest bucket of hogwash I've ever heard in my life. We're going to talk about this here in a minute. But at no point in time anywhere in the world that we know of today are they having public spectacles where humans are fighting humans to the death. There are not people on broad national policies being executed for their beliefs. Not in the modern world or the Western world. We have more freedom. We have more information. We have more than we ever have in the United States and the rest of the world. So it all goes back to how you choose to look at it. Fear not. I think is an important mindset to have when you look at it, because it's easy to focus on the negatives of what we have, but there's less negatives today than there's ever been. Now, we have more awareness of those negatives than we ever have before. And I think because we're aware of them, sometimes it's easy to dwell on them and to do that. But that's not what we're supposed to do. You know, the gospel is called the good news because it is hope. The gospel at its root is about reconciling the gap between God and man through sacrifice, through obedience, and things that go with it. So let's just look at some statistics here to go with this about the church. It is estimated at the time of Christ's death. Does anybody want to guess how many Christians there were in the world at the time of Christ's death? What the estimates were? First century AD? Oh, come on. Somebody play along. Huh? A few hundred? Anybody else? 5,000? Sociologists estimate, based on Roman Empire documents and everything else, that at the time of Christ's death, there were 1,000 Christians that would wear the banner, that would carry on and be the foundation of the church. In 100 AD, 100 years later, those numbers estimated to be at 7,500. This is in the Roman Empire during a time of persecution, during a time that you could be arrested, you could be humiliated, you could be tortured, or you could be executed for your belief. Think about that. In 100 years, that's how much of a threat Jesus and the Christian movement became in 100 years that they needed to deter and to extinguish, but yet we still see a 7.5 times multiplying. In 150 AD, 50 years later, the Christians have exploded to an estimated 40,000 in number. Now, I did not do good research at this point in time, and Carla will understand what I'm getting ready to say here. I did not think about seeing what the world's population was in 350 AD. Let's ask. What was the world's population in 350 AD? World population by year. Well, how far does it? All right, there we go. Whew, I jumped quick. So in 200 AD to 600 AD, they estimate the population was 190 million to 2 million. Or 190 to 200 million. So if we have a mathlete here in 150 AD, we can figure out that what 40,000 out of 190 million is. All right, so then in 150 AD, so then here's another benchmark year, 313 AD. Does anybody know what happens? Who's the Roman emperor at this time? Man, history class. Roman emperor at this time is a guy named Constantine. He issues the Edict of Milan, which then converts the oppression of Christianity to being a tolerated group. So it is now no longer a crime. It is now no longer a social taboo, which it still is, but it's not official. We don't have the persecution and things going on there with it. At 350 AD, the number of Christians has bloomed to 34 million. So from 150 to 350 in 200 years, it blooms to 34 million. 380 AD, Theodosius, it makes the official statement declaring Christianity the official religion of the Roman Catholic, or of the Holy Roman Empire. That's when they become the Holy Roman Empire. 400 AD, St. Jerome puts the Bible together of the Old Testament and New Testament in the big first publication of all 66 books of the Bible. Now, this is a talk for another day. But to go from 1,000 to 34 million and becoming in basically conquering the Roman Empire from within, guess what they didn't have? They didn't have one of these. Which then begs the question, what were they doing? They didn't have one of these. Everybody forgets sometimes, especially when it comes to our morality and our high horse, this exists because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, not the other way around. It's just a little food for thought there. So, how does this all start? Where does it go? What happens? And what's the details? What's the juice? I'm glad you asked. Let's go to John chapter 21, verse 15. Let's hope my paperclip system works out here. Oh, there we go. I can tell I'm getting older because lighting determines my ability to see. Michelle keeps telling me, you just wait, it's coming. She's 7 years older than me, so it's, to go with it. So in my Bible, this is an NIV Bible. It's a Maxwell Leadership Bible. And the little subheading here says, Jesus reinstates Peter. So we know up at this point, at the time of crucifixion, how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times, thrice denied. If you've ever listened to the first baseball game by Dan St. Paul, you know that Peter plays catcher, Jesus is the pitcher. And that's what Jesus is giving him a sermon on the mount. He was denied 3 times, and now he's giving him a sermon on the mount. One of my favorite comedy sketches of all times. But Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. The Christians have been scattered. They're cowering. All 1,000 of them. They're fearful for their lives. Their leader has just been publicly executed, and Jesus has come back. And here we go. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? I don't know if we're talking about in context the other disciples, but Peter was kind of the first. He's the rock, the guy that they build the church off of, the fisherman. Uneducated, big sticking point for Paul. Paul and Peter become competitors throughout the New Testament for, who do we look for? Paul's got the pedigree, the education and the political connections. Peter's just some dumb fisherman. A lot of beef there that goes with that. And Peter responds, yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus says, feed my sheep. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says, feed my sheep. Some translations say take care. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter's hurt. This is a little bit of a ego check and a reminder, because how many times did he deny Jesus? And so now he has his 3rd public reassurance or profession. Do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all these things that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. That is the foundation. That is what it's all based upon, how we go from 1,000 to 34 million in a few hundred years. 3 times he denies, 3 times he confirms. And Peter is given a commandment and given his walking orders to build the church that Jesus says, this is the rock upon which my church will build. And maybe it was because he wasn't educated. Maybe it was because he didn't have the political connections. Maybe it had to be someone like that to reach the common person, to reach the fishermen and the lower echelon in society. Maybe that's what it took. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can just speculate with what goes there. But Jesus says, feed my sheep, care for my sheep, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. And I think it's important that we differentiate right now that the sheep is not the church. Because we know from John 3:16 that it's the world, that we are all sheep looking for a shepherd. And that's what we're being called to be as Christians, is to be the shepherd. We are to be the one to care, protect, and feed. That does not mean we're called to just wear a cross around our neck. or have a cross tattoo or something along those lines. I've got one of those. We're not called to come to church on Sunday and just be there for praise and worship because that makes us feel good. I have underwent I don't know what you would call it, simplification of faith maybe. That I look at the Acts-based church and I look at the church today and I see a machine that's been created to collect money, gather assets, and build big buildings and miss the point of the work. I see ivory towers with people that don't want to get their hands dirty. I won't get into, if you want an interesting story to read about Joel Osteen and Mattress Mac. Read about that, and you'll find out the difference between an ivory tower and someone that's feeding the sheep. We're called to feed the sheep, not build big buildings, not post on Facebook about what we think is right or wrong, and post those scriptures because, it irritates the crap out of me to see someone posting scripture and then having a heart full or a mouth full of hate and negativity and things like that. You'll find out in life I'm a consistency guy. If there's one thing that I try to be all the time, it's consistent. Jesus says, feed my sheep. He doesn't call us to tell people to feed the sheep. He calls us to do the feeding of the sheep. He doesn't call us to have Bible studies. He doesn't call us to do all of the things that the modern church is doing that's not directly feeding the sheep. And I talk about my simplification of faith. I think that you get up and there's a lot of things that we do out of ritual, that we do out of, well, that's how it's been done, that causes us to miss the point of what the commandment and what the commander said for us to do. You go through all of Jesus' ministry, and he was amongst the people. He was an example. He lived, he taught, he talked, he ate, and he was there. He was real. And I think a lot of times in our church, in our faith walk, we miss that point. And there's a lot of people that are unhappy and they're unfulfilled and they feel guilty. And that guilt is not because of what they've done. It's probably because of what they haven't done. I have some of the most miserable people I know are people that are wildly successful. They've done crazy things. They've done all kinds of things like that. But they're off purpose. They're not fulfilling what they were called to do. Their calling, their purpose, what they're supposed to do. And that causes a lack of joy. And there's rebellion that goes with that. We created a mission statement a few weeks ago, or a month or a couple of months ago. It says that the mission of RCC is to grow our faith and congregation through the service of others. I couldn't find my exact copy of that. I think that's right. But through service. And that's what feeding the sheep is. It is being that person that somebody calls at 3 a.m. when they're stuck on the side of the road. It's being that being that person that when you're asked, you say yes. Even when you know you shouldn't, even when you're angry, even when it's inconvenient. That's what we're called to be. That's what feeding the sheep was. They were able to grow to 34 million, take over the Roman Empire, and do so not having a Bible, the majority of that time not being able to publicly meet, not being able to share their historical documents, not being able to do all the things that we take for granted every single day as believers that we can do, but we don't. They couldn't do, but they did. Man, that was some word gymnastics right there. Put it on a t-shirt. But that's how they grew. They grew through influence. They grew through relationships. They grew because they were there for one another. When somebody's business was destroyed, they were there to build it back. When somebody's family, when the head was arrested, they were there to provide for the rest of the family. They were there to, when the sick were, when the plagues were raging and the people were dying, they were there taking care of the sick, making sure they were fed, cared for, loved. All of those things is how they grew. It wasn't because of their orthodoxy. It wasn't because of their doctrine. It wasn't because of all those things that were out there. They did it simply because they rolled up their sleeves. They got their hands dirty. They got their hearts dirty. They got their feelings hurt. They dealt with disappointment. They dealt with the frustrations of helping someone and then seeing them go another way. But that's what it means to feed the sheep. One more scripture before I finish up here. Paperclip system, don't fail me now. I never know when I have a paperclip in my Bible if it's because it was the last sermon or if it's something important. I never know. My ADHD kicks in and I don't know that there. Matthew 9:35-37. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into harvest the fields." We live in a world today of people that are dying, literally dying, because they feel like they are alone and they don't have anybody. We live in a world today where we are pitted against one another based on race, political affiliation, gender. I mean, what is not a divisive topic that can be addressed that we're divided by someone over something? And what we've been called to do supersedes all of that, because we're called to be the friend, to hold the hand, to give the hug, to have the shoulder, to do those things. Now, I'm confident in our group that there's a lot of those things that are being done. I know most of you pretty well. I know what kind of people you are. I know what your heart is. I know what your character is. You know, and I'll tell you, a big testament today that we're a service-oriented group is that Jerry is sitting right there today. Because somebody, Barb and Mike, saw to it that they went and got him and saw to it that he was here. That's the kind of things that we're supposed to do. Those are the things that we've been called to do. Compassion, helpless, harassed, sheep without a shepherd. I think I only read the last verse. I don't think I read the other part that I was supposed to go with that, but it talks about those things. As I close, I just want to talk about kind of summarize a couple things from, previous sermons that I've had. I've talked about, the thief on the cross, Jesus is being crucified. You have two people. They were actually not thieves. That's kind of a dumbed down simplification. They were actually insurrectionists and enemies of the state, and they had long criminal history. You didn't get crucified for being a thief. But you had one who said that he didn't deserve this. He rejected accountability, and he mocked Jesus and was a jerk. Then you had another that understood that he knew the other guy, and he said, "We're getting what we deserve, but this guy doesn't need that." He had compassion. He was humble, had humility, and understood what was fixing to happen. And he thought enough, and he was humble enough to ask Jesus to remember him. That's the only person we know in the Bible that's in heaven for sure, is the one that Jesus said, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." But he gives us a model of salvation, of recognizing his shortcomings, having the compassion to see the innocence of others and understand that what he was getting was what he deserved, and then having the humility to ask to be remembered, understanding that he himself was not enough, that he couldn't close the gap between God and himself because of his sin and because of the things that were there, and asking for forgiveness and remembrance of that. He really didn't have a massive confession. He was humble. He asked to be remembered. And then as you go forward from that, and you see the example that is made, it's abundantly clear of how we can grow the church through humility, through grace, and understanding, taking action. But the most important thing for us to grow the church is a word that a lot of you will probably cringe a little bit when I say it. Because any adult that I know, at least me, when I hear this word, I just kind of roll my eyes a little bit, but the word is obedience. If we're obedient to the commandment, if we're obedient to the instructions that Jesus gave to feed the sheep, we will find fulfillment, we will find our purpose, and we will find joy in that obedience. So my challenge to you as a congregation, moving forward over the next few months, we're getting into the hardest time of year for a lot of people. Look for who needs a shoulder. Look for who you can be a friend to. Look for who you can influence. And they may be too much for you to handle on an individual basis, but you can always invite them to come here and be a part of us, because there's more shoulders here where we can help you help them. And be mindful of that as we go forward, because that's the commandment that we're called to do. To be the shepherd like Christ and feed the sheep.